Hey guys, it's Chris with Nichols Retirement Empire, and today I'm going to do a education video. I haven't done one in a while, and this one is going to be about an incident that took place here about a week or so ago, I believe, about the 6-year-old student that brought a gun to school and shot their teacher. You may have seen this on the news. Um, it's not a video that I look forward to doing. I don't really. I've been out of teaching for a while and out of administration for a while, and I see things on the news and I don't always comment on them. But this one, I have a little bit of an odd take on it that I'm going to present to you because these are things that the news may not really talk about. They may talk about it a little bit, and there are certainly things that the average person is not going to think about when seeing a situation like this. A perspective that I have from 30 years in education and from being a teacher as well as an administrator that some other people are not going to have. Now, first of all, the incident, I'll just kind of briefly describe it. There's not just a ton of detail out there about it. There's not going to be because it's a school and it's a 6-year-old. And from what the news said, there may be some new reports out. The student was 6 years old. They brought a gun in their backpack, and in the afternoon, the teacher was in front of the class, apparently teaching. The student got the gun out of their backpack, pointed at the teacher, shot the teacher with one shot, and it didn't kill the teacher, but it did injure her. It shot her hand in her upper chest, and she got the students out of the classroom, across the hall. I don't know how she managed to keep the student that shot her, in the classroom. Went down the hall, got to the office, all that kind of stuff. And then, of course, the police and everybody showed up. They took her to the hospital. The student, after that, was restrained by a faculty member. They didn't identify who, whether it was an administrator or I don't know. But the student was being restrained in that room. The police show up. The student, was fighting with or hit the faculty member. Kind of struggled with the police a little bit. They got the child, put him in the police car. They're 6 years old. So where do you take them? You're not taking them to jail. You're not taking them before a judge. Anyway, they were able to get the student, in some kind of medical facility. I don't know if it was a hospital or whatever, where they were evaluated. And then they, got a judge to do an order to have the child kept under observation or some kind of medical observation. Even the legal system does not have a process for what you do with a criminal 6-year-old because they're not considered a criminal. They're a child. They can't, be responsible for their actions. So they're kind of in all this legal limbo, and the sheriff, while they were interviewing, kept saying, well, this is an unprecedented situation. And they really don't know what to do. So let's look at a few things here about this incident that the press may not talk about. First of all, I saw a lot of people respond and say, well, I hope this child gets the help that they need, and these problems get addressed and that kind of thing. Well, when you're 6 years old, there really aren't, number one, there's very few actual real child psychiatrists or psychologists, because you can't really diagnose a 6-year-old. You can't tell if they're bipolar. You can't tell if they have depressive disorder. You can't tell that stuff because they're 6 years old. They can't diagnose. There might be some people out there that are willing to throw out there, yeah, I'll diagnose them, but there's not many that are willing to do that because you can't. Their brain's not developed, things like that. They don't even have. You can't even determine if a 6-year-old really is even qualified for special education. And this child they may have been looking at the behaviors this child had, and they might be documenting those behaviors, and they might be on the road to saying this child as a special education student or special needs student. I don't know if they're doing that already. They may have been. But, at that point, they're kind of under the protection of being a behavior, special education student. And, but even at 6 years old, those kids aren't ready for that. I will say this: I have friends they're elementary school principals and things like that, and the thing that they have told me, especially over the last few years, is that they are seeing more and more and more situations where students come into kindergarten and they have absolutely never been told what to do in their entire life. They have no concept of getting in a line. They have no concept of doing what they're told to do. They have no concept of social behavior whatsoever. They hit, they run, they try to run out of the building, they bite, and I'm talking about adults. I'm not talking about the other kids. He's like, it's like they have no control whatsoever, and nobody has ever made them do anything. And then you have to get them into school and socialize these students. And he said there are more and more and more of these students out there, and it's just wild to have to deal with that. And you can ask the teacher, if you know teachers that deal with students this age, what is happening and what they're having to deal with. And this is another case of that. I'm not going to try to get in and determine why that's happening and that kind of things, but it is, and it's something that teachers and schools are having to deal with. That is not a good thing to have to run a school and educate and teach kids when you're dealing with extreme behaviors on a, just one student like that can turn your school upside down. If you have 5, 6, 7, 8 of these kids that you're having to restrain from running out of your building all the time, that's a problem. That's taking up valuable time that you're having to spend on those kind of behaviors. It's when that student is taken maybe out of their home to determine, what might be wrong, that kind of thing. Number one, you don't know that there is anything wrong. He may come from a perfectly normal home. And people are like, well, that lady, she had a gun in her home and the kid was able to find the gun. And she may have been, at fault for that. She may have just had the gun laying around. I don't know. But she may have had it locked up and the kid knew how to get the key. Kids are smart. You don't know. I don't know the circumstance of how that student got that gun. But I do know that it's not for sure that was a bad home. It's not for sure. And it may have been horrible. I don't know. They may have been drug dealers that just had stuff, whatever. But you don't know for sure. The students that are doing these things are not necessarily students from just horrible, horrible backgrounds and horrible, horrible homes. I'm sure a lot of them are. I'm sure most of them probably are. I'm sure everybody's thinking that this student was in a situation where there's just, the home was totally crazy and out of control and chaotic and all that. And it may have been. I don't know. But anyway, the student was able to get a gun at their house. Now, the parent may be held legally liable for it, but in Virginia, I don't think they have gun laws that spell out exactly how you have to store your weapon and keep it safe. But I'm sure the parent could be somehow legally liable and have to pay some kind of penalty. But the child will not. They do not. They can't be held responsible for that kind of act. They can't really do a whole lot to help this student. Like, they could probably do some things behaviorally to help the student learn how to manage their behavior better, to manage their anger, to manage their emotions, things like that. There are things out there and things that that counselors and stuff can do, but they can't medicate them. They can't. It's really kind of up in the air about what they can do to help the child. Now, here's the unique take that I have on it that a lot of people won't have. That student, that child, is going to be back in a classroom with the other children probably pretty soon. Probably really soon. There's not a place to put them and keep them away from other children. Now, you may say, well, you know, we always focus on the child that needs the help with the behavior issue, but we don't focus on everybody else around that person. In the past, that used to be the case, and it wasn't necessarily the best thing to do. But in the past, it was like, well, what's best for society? For society, the best thing is to not have that child around these other children. But we don't do that anymore, because in the past, when we did do that, we weren't very fair with it, and we didn't do, we were putting people away in institutions and mistreating those people and things like that. And we've swung the other way now, where we don't, we're very concerned about mistreating these people. And so you don't want to take this child out of their environment and take them away from other children. But, if I'm a parent and next year, when I know that child is back sitting next to my, 7-year-old daughter, I might have a problem with that. And here's the thing. If this child's not responsible right now for their actions, they're not going to be responsible at 7 years old. And they could do something like this again. They really could. And you know what would happen then? The same thing that's happened. They could do this over and over again. Now, does that happen? No, but technically, yes, they could do this over and over again. They're not going to be responsible at 7 years old. They're not going to be responsible at 8 years old. They're not going to be responsible at 9 years old. They're not going to be responsible at 10 years old. They're not going to be responsible at 11 years old. When they get to 12 years old, there is a chance possibly that maybe if they do something really, really bad, there could be some kind of consequence with the juvenile detention system, that kind of thing. Possibly. It's not until you're 15, 16 years old that there really is a chance that when you're doing these types of violent acts, that there really might be something they do with you. So if this child is completely not responsible, but and then on the other hand, well, how do you hold them responsible? They're little kids. They're 6 years old. But it's just scary as a parent and as an adult and as a teacher and as an administrator to think that this student is going to be right back in your school. And that's the way the states handle it and the federal government handles it now. We had students in the schools where I taught that were, where we used to put them in schools away from the other kids. The Office of Civil Rights basically told the state of Georgia, you can't do that. We had to start taking those students that were violent students, and they might have been special needs students, but they were violent. Maybe they had tried to commit arson, or they had attacked their parents, or they had, done all kind of things. And they, were in special education program. Well, they had to be in the building with your other students. They had to be housed with your other students. And not only that, they wanted them in classes, if at all possible, with, the regular education students. And I knew that kind of thing as an administrator. That's why I always told my daughters that you have no idea who you're in that classroom with. I mean, there could be kids in there that have raped, killed. I mean, you have no idea. And I always taught my daughters never, to underestimate or just think everybody's normal in your room, because they're not. But I mean, we would have students in there that were like that, and they would get mad and try to run out of the room and try to run out of the building, and we'd have to, close that hallway off and take 3 or 4 administrators and counselors and a resource officer and all this stuff and try to stop them from leaving the building. Sometimes we'd have to restrain the students, things like that. And it would take hours and hours and hours sometimes on one day to just deal with the behavior of this one student. And, we had many students like that. And those students are in these schools. You don't know if they're in your school or not. They're not going to tell you. But you have students like that in schools all over the place, because the Office of Civil Rights says that these students have a right to be in school and they have a right to be around their peers. But what about the peers? What about the safety of everybody else? How do you weigh that out? How do you weigh this person's right, against everybody else's rights? to be safe. I don't know. And the other students may not even have known what was going on. That's the kind of system that this 6-year-old is going to be going in. And so they're going to be back in a school. Now, is that right or wrong? I don't know. That's the way it is right now. And people need to realize that. A lot of parents don't realize who the kids that are in their rooms, who their kids are in a class with. They don't know. The other thing is, once this kid goes into the system, you're never going to hear what happens. It's against the law. That student has privacy rights, things like that. They're only 6 years old. They're not going to release their name, things like that. So once they get into this process, the story's over for the press, other than what happens to the parent. So, you're never going to hear about it. The other thing is the restraint. The Office of Civil Rights wants reports on any time we restrain students in schools. Used to, and again, the reason they're doing it is because in the past, it wasn't done correctly. Students were restrained and they were hurt. Students were restrained too often. Students were restrained for no good reason. Because of the things that we did in the past that weren't right, now we're having to pay the price, and keep track of all that. But like that student was restrained. Well, that student, the way it works is the school has to have training. There's only certain people that can restrain students, and they have to be trained to do it. And they can only do it for a certain amount of time, then they have to let them go. They can only do it a certain way. It has to be safe, that kind of thing. So technically, if that student was being restrained and they were being restrained by a person that's not trained to restrain a student, or they restrained them too long, or they restrained them, technically the school could be liable for restraining that student, even though they shot somebody. Now, a judge, of course, if the parent said, you know what, they shouldn't have restrained my son for that long, that kind of thing, and they could sue the school. And of course, a judge could probably look at it and go, you know what, he shot somebody. A reasonable person would assume that I need to restrain this child before he hurts somebody else. And so the kind of restraint does not matter as long as they did what a reasonable person would do, and a judge could throw it out. But, even kids that do that kind of thing in education, they have to account for what they did after that student hurt somebody or shot somebody or kicked somebody or whatever. You can't just like grab them and tie them down with a rope, crazy stuff like that. Schools have to account for it. They'll have to fill out a report for how they restrained that student and how long they restrained that student for and what kind of restraint it was and things like that. And that's the only, most people, the news media would never think, well, how was he restrained? And my thing is, I don't know what the student was doing. I don't understand how the teacher got the kids out and kept that kid in that room. But she did. Maybe the kid just stayed in there. I don't know. But the student, was fighting with the administrator or the school employee, was fighting with the police. It's just one of those things. It's just a scary thing in education to know that those students are out there. And the stories, you don't even get them. You don't even know. You have, because they're children, and it can't be told. You can't talk about it. You can't, there were so many situations when I was an administrator where something would happen and the parents would want to know why what are you doing with the other kid? What and I couldn't tell them. Even if their child was involved in an incident with that student, I couldn't tell them what was happening with that other student. I couldn't tell them they were special education. I couldn't tell them they were behavior disordered. I couldn't tell them, you couldn't. And that student's going to be back in a school. And they may have a very long road of repeated behaviors. Maybe not where they're shooting somebody, maybe not to that extent, but they're going to have a long road of repeated behaviors. They're going to continue, and they're going to stay in a school until they're, old enough to get into the system where they are taken out. But it takes a long time to do that. Or the student may come back and never do anything again. I don't know. But I know that's kind of the story behind that and what's going to happen, and how that there are so many things that the press is never going to know and they're never going to cover. they'll focus on, whether or not, what happens to the family and how are they held responsible for that child being able to get a gun. And they'll talk about gun laws and they'll talk about all this kind of stuff. And that'll be the focus of the story. But it's not just about that. It's about how our system has those kind of students. What are they supposed to do with them? Who has the answer for how we take care of these kids? How do we provide them an education and treat them right? And then the story never focuses on everybody else. It never focuses on all the other students and how everybody else feels about having that student out there. And we live in a dangerous world. I mean, we go out and there's people like that all over the place. There's people like that in our grocery stores. There's people like that in our streets. There's people like that. And you hate to be negative and you hate to think, everybody around me is dangerous and things like that. You want to live your life, and you want to be comfortable in public and but you still have to be pragmatic and be reasonable and understand that that's the way the world is. I don't think it's being negative. I think it's just being realistic. And I was very realistic with my children because I understand the way things are. Again, I'm not saying whether it's right or wrong, but I think it's to be real. We need to start looking at as a country and as states and things like that is what's the impact that these people are having on all these other children, all the children that had to watch their teacher get shot. What about them? What about their mental health? What about the rest of their educational career? But it's all, we don't pay attention to the victims. We don't pay attention to these, everybody else that has to live in the world of us take care and protect this one's, rights. And it's always been like that in the United States. We've always had a battle back and forth, the individual rights versus, what's good for the public. And we'll continue to do that. But this is a very good circumstance and situation to see that as bad as it is. And, what are we going to focus on in the media? What are we going to focus on as a nation? I don't know. But I do know that is a real situation that we face. And I hope that it gets better. Thanks for watching, guys. Nichols Retirement Empire. Again, these are all just my opinions. I don't know all that much about the case, but I do know a lot about education and how things run today. So thanks for watching, guys. See you.